Good morning, traders. Welcome to Charts and Large Mugs of Coffee. Hope everyone is doing well this morning. We are going to take a look at the NASDAQ as we kick things off. And as always, if you got some questions, let me know what you're looking at, what time frame you're looking at. You're looking long or short. Maybe you're already in it. Maybe you're looking for a setup. Let me know. The more detail, the better. So let's get those questions in early. Good morning. Good morning. All right. So shout out to our YouTube and my viewers on X and our Simpler Essentials room. Let's get to it. You know what's happening, right? I don't need to tell you. You know what's happening right now. This is the NASDAQ. Why is it up? High concentration weighting. You thought I was going to say NVIDIA, right? Well, partly yes. High concentration weighting. What happens when a high concentration weighted stock, why were the Magnificent Seven so magnificent? Because they are the heaviest weighted stocks in the NASDAQ and in the heaviest weighted sectors in the NASDAQ. So when we have something like an NVIDIA, an Apple, a Microsoft, a Meta, an Amazon, when those earnings come out, there's going to be movement. And so now we're seeing the aftermath, 19,000. Look, whether it's NVIDIA, whether it's the far fewer, but they're coming, rate cuts from the Federal Reserve, we're just going to echo what we've been saying in Charts and Coffee here for many months, which is it's tough to be a bear. If there are periods of weakness, we want to find the trends. We want to buy the dip, rinse and repeat. So let's talk about what we've got here this morning. Now, obviously, I'm not going to chase. Well, I shouldn't say obviously. I will not be chasing 19,000 on the NAS. We'll take a look at what type of day trades could set up. Obviously we've got strength, but where are we going to see the most strength? It's not going to be across the board, right? Because does the NASDAQ strength, in this case, caused by NVIDIA, necessarily help the Russell? No, there's no weighting. What about helping the, now if SMCI moves with NVIDIA, now remember, SMCI is not in the semiconductor sector. It's in small caps, right? But if the general gist of semis moving higher helps other semi stocks, specifically SMCI, we'll see things like the Russell move. We're not seeing strength on the Russell right now in quite the same way that we're seeing on NVIDIA, meaning when I look at what trends we are going to inherit this morning, where are the 5-minute trends? They're in the S&P and they're in the NASDAQ. Now, why the S&P and not the Dow? The Dow does have weighting in the XLK. And NVIDIA is the third or fourth heaviest weighted stock in the XLK. But in terms of concentration, in terms of weighting, it's not that high. So it's not as if NVIDIA is in the Dow. There's a sector in the Dow that has some of those stocks. So again, having the weighting makes a whole lot more sense when we're looking at why things are up or down. So ES and NQ, obviously, we're seeing that nice 5-minute trend this morning. So those are the relative performance. Relative to what? Relative to Russell, Dow, S&P, NASDAQ, to each other. And that's what we've got this morning, right? Ultimately, today is the day that I will look for the beginning of pullback buys that we can take into the end of the week or even into next week. Remember, profit taking, if someone's long, profit taking is selling. If there's enough people that are selling to get a profit, remember, on the flip side of that, someone's getting short. Remember, there's no only buying. There's buying at higher highs while sellers are willing to sell at those or short from those higher highs. Remember, it's never a one-way street. On the other side of every buy is a sell. And if enough of that profit taking gains some traction, then we might get some pullbacks. And those are the kind of things that I'll look to take advantage of in the aftermath of, right? So that's where we sit right now. And let's see what we've got here in terms of questions. I see them coming in. All right. So Line Watcher asks, is there a metric I use to determine when the market gets too hot? It seems that we are about to go parabolic. Line Watcher, the only thing, so let's talk about that in the most basic sense, resistance, right? The only reason that I will look for resistance is for long positions. I'm not looking at resistance as this is the top, right? So what are some of the interesting words that have been euphemisms for top picking? Now, we all know we don't want to be top pickers, right? But sometimes they masquerade around as parabolic, overbought, mean reversion, right? If something's going up, as Sun Tzu says, if your enemy is making a mistake, let them. If a market wants to make higher highs, let it, right? Let it. Don't step out in front of the freight train and think it's going to stop 2 inches from our nose. So what I'll say is I never want to even ask that question. You know, my trading career has never been reliant on, oh, this is the top. The difference between this is the top and this might be resistance are two different things. One is, well, I'm going to pick the top and I'm going to short it. How many times are you going to be wrong before that's right? And I know that's not necessarily what you're asking. What I will ask myself is, where is resistance? And in this case, let's look at the price movement ranges, the PMRs. In this case, on the daily time frame, the daily PMRs. What does that tell me? There's a typical amount of price that the S&P or the NAS or even NVIDIA is capable of making when we look back at its typical nature, not the outlier days like today, but what it does most of the time. So in the case of the NAS, 5,400 is very, I'm sorry, in the case of the S&P, 5,400 is very much in reach. You know, if I look at the NAS, in terms of where that resistance could be, take a peek, right around, it's probably going to be a little bit higher than this when the bell rings because these DPMRs are from yesterday. They'll be freshened up at the bell. But again, I'm looking at higher highs. So I try not to concern myself with if we're too hot or if we're too high, because really nobody knows. And that's what I'm always going to root everything that I do in. I don't know the future, but I can see the trend and I can see the momentum. And we can see, right, the higher highs and the higher lows. So let it, right? That's my take on that. Now, it also depends on what time frame you're looking at, right? So a 5-minute is going to possibly move likely move a whole lot differently than a 1 hour chart. And a 1 hour is going to look different than the daily. So picking the time frame, therefore also the time horizon that you want to engage is really important. So thank you for the question. That's a really timely one. And I would say really don't ask the question, right? Because it's not going to give you the answer you think it's going to give you, which is, oh, maybe this is a good place to short. And then if you're wondering, Rog, no, I'm long and I'm looking at a target, look at resistance. Maybe look at the daily price movement range. Look at major and minor psychological levels, and those will help. All right, SMCI, as you can see here, moving higher. Remember, SMCI is not part of the semiconductor sector, SMH, but it is part of the Russell. So will the high tide of NVIDIA help a lot of the boats? Very likely. You can see where SMCI is trading right now, and clearly it's benefiting. Am I going to do anything at the higher highs? Of course not. However, take a look at the opportunities in the 5-minute time frame for intraday pullback buys. So let someone else pick the top. Right? Kind of going back to Line Watcher's question. Hey, Rog, are we hot? Very likely. But let someone else figure out where they want to step in front of the freight train. We'll buy the dip in those places that are in uptrends. But I do want to remind everybody, SMCI just had a breakout for no reason of its own, but mostly because of the high tide of NVIDIA. At least that's what it looks like. Because look, yesterday it closed at 904, right? Or no, it closed at 875. So it's up today. Again, rising tide. All right, XLF. Did we have, as far as earnings in terms of SMCI, I mean, take a look. That was on the 30th. Really didn't do much, did it? All right, XLF. Financials. Good morning. Hey there, Paul and Jim. Both have questions on financials. Financials have been a crazy, crazy week. First, we had the investor day with JP Morgan, and JP Morgan did all sorts of crazy things. It's the number 2 weighted stock here, right? Berkshire, by the way, is number 1. If XLF can pull back the daily price movement range, that would be great. But I will say this, Jim, financials, whether it be JP Morgan on investor day or whether it be Schwab yesterday, Schwab had some crazy move yesterday, way beyond the typical price movement range. It was probably the largest outside the normal historical volatility move we've seen all year. There's been some weird moves in financials. I'm going to let this week to sort of settle down because there's been some odd movement. The best way to engage financials, seeing what we've seen this week, is going to be likely XLF. So I like where you're looking. ELF. Sorry, I saw XLF. Sorry, Jim. Paul, yeah, what I'll say is XLF will likely be the best way to engage financial stocks rather than going with an individual one. Daily price movement range buy is absolutely valid. Just heads up, it's been a little bit more volatility. All right, ELF. Red candles above the 200, moving higher today. It's up 10 points. But again, nothing for me to do. So let's go back, right? Because sometimes today is not the day the trade is. It's what day was the trade. Take a look at the Darvis levels at 153.30, 154.80. Jim, take a look at those support levels. If you're looking at an opportunity to buy ELF, do it from support, right? It's a variation of buy the dip. It's not buy the dip, because buy the dip should ideally be done in a trend, but it's a variation of, right? So ultimately, what happens in something like this is if you're thinking, hey, we could find some support, wait for a minor low, find the Darvis, get long at that point. So really, if you're wondering, okay, Rob, with that being said, that setup that you just described, Darvis and minor low, what day did that trigger? You can go back and look on your charts for what jives with what you're doing. Specifically, the date of the buy specifically was on the 21st of May as price traded higher through 158. So say 158.05, 158.10 would be the trigger on the 21st. And then that would set up where we are now. And that's the buy. That's the way that sets up. Something similar happened on the 1st and it triggered on the 3rd. So that's a minor low off the Darvis level. All right. Next up, editor asks, would I buy NVIDIA before or after the split? Okay, let me give you all some data and then you can make your own call. So if you look at the history of splits in stocks, typically what happens is that retail traders, and look, no one listening to me right now is an average retail trader. None of you, because you're spending the time to educate yourself. It's 9:12 in the morning and you're already thinking, okay, how do I prepare for the day? So let's remember, you're not an average retail trader. No one listening to me right now. Average retail traders, for whatever reason, the idea of a split will get them to buy, because what they're thinking is, if I buy NVIDIA today at 1,014, when it splits, I'll have X number of shares. And it doesn't matter, NVIDIA, any stock that's about to split. They'll buy it now and say, well, when it splits, I'll have this many shares. You can also buy after the split and still get that many shares for the same number of dollars and likely less. So here's a little stat for y'all. Typically, after a split, there's what? It's profit taking, right? Because there's that pre-split rally that happens because retail traders are tripping over themselves to buy a stock's pre-split. After the split, there is typically, I'm not saying NVIDIA will do this, but there is typically an up to 10% pullback in the price of the stock. So there's your answer. I'm always going to wait till after. The great news about NVIDIA is it's going to finally become a much more affordable trading stock, and I'm looking very forward to that. All right, next up, TMUS on the daily. Love the specificity. Fantastic. Eddie, daily time frame of TMUS. It resides in the XLC. It resides also in the IYZ. It's a telecommunication name. And so what we're looking at here is a range. So what do we do with the range? Have some way to identify this. You can use the Darvis 2.0. You can use the Darvis 3.0. This is not a Darvis box in the traditional sense. This is actually based on Darvis. I like to play homage to the folks who, inspired us, right? We stand atop the shoulder of giants, don't we? So this is based on the work of Darvis, but it's not a traditional Darvis box. What it does do is it automates the support and resistance for us. That said, it's very similar to the question earlier that Jim asked about ELF. What would be the days we want to buy? The 8th and this one's a little tricky here. This would be tricky. I would say you could probably do it on the 16th. There's actually an inside candle after the minor low. So you're buying as close to 162 to even 160, 170 as possible. Now here's what that does. If TMUS is able to take out 166.5, that will then be a momentum play. What's momentum? What's happening under the surface? There are buy stops that are going to be waiting just above 166.5, right? Traders that are preparing for the movement through a resistance level. That's great. That's going to help us. However, there's going to be sell stops waiting just below that level. So there's a battle of sell stops and buy stops, or I should say limit orders to sell and buy stops. So there'll be orders parked around that level, just below and just above. What we want to do is just always assume a market's going to stay in the range until it's proven otherwise. So if we have a range as wide as this is not a narrow range, right? We have a range, relatively as wide as this. You buy the lower end of the range, you take maybe half profit at the top of the range, and then if that momentum kicks in, you've got, maybe 1/3, 1/2 of your position left to take advantage of the momentum leg of this. So rather than reducing your trading to momentum only, ask yourself, how do I trade exhaustion, buying near the support of the Darvis, and prepare for the potential for momentum? And that's the way I would set up TMUS. All right, next up. And yes, gang, for those of you that are wondering, will NVIDIA likely continue to run up till the split on what, the 10th? Probably. That's typical retail behavior. Now, let's buy this thing because it's going to split, right? So yes, very likely, somewhat sadly. It's very tradable, though. It's very tradable because of that bullish retail investor participation that will happen. It's like clockwork. Something's going to split. They're going to want to buy it. But remember, after the split, you can still buy the stock. It's going to be ultimately more or less the same price. But you might say, Rog, what if it runs up before then? After the split, go, and don't take my word for it. Go back and look at 4 or 5 stocks that you've looked at in the past after they've split. And I'm not saying the day of the split or the day after. All I'm saying is trade it with a short-term time frame to the 10th. But if you want to buy and hold shares of NVIDIA, that's a different conversation, right? That will be better done after the split, more often than not. Okay, next up is, and again, those of you that are long NVIDIA, congrats. That's a wonderful trade. It's a nice way to wake up in the morning with something closed at, 9:50 and you wake up to it trading at 10:15, 10:16. That's a nice way to wake up in the morning. All right, thoughts on General Motors. This was something we talked about in the Sector Secrets Mastery. Thanks for the question. We decided to pass on it, but ultimately this area, I think the zone that we talked about in the notes, hang on, I can tell you right now. The zone that we talked about in the notes was 44.25 to 44.05 to 44.05. So a 20-cent range near the bottom of the range. So down to 44, up to 45.25, 44.25. So in that area, right around 44, if you're looking to buy that support level of the Darvis, that would be on the daily chart of General Motors. That was something we had talked about actually just yesterday. All right. And if you want to know more about what we're doing in the Sector Secrets Mastery, what kind of trades are we putting on? I'm in a lot of metals and mining this morning, right? I'm trading around the NVIDIA. I'll wait for the dust to settle. I'll wait for the confetti to quit falling out of the ceiling. And then we'll re-engage those tech stocks. But in the meantime, I'm trading around that event because I don't want to be in this binary, either really right or really wrong type situation. But ultimately, yeah, today we're going to start looking at tech and see what kind of pullbacks we could take advantage of. But in the meantime, if you're looking for ways to handle the current price action, Rod, where are the trends? And take the earnings out of it for a moment, right? Those are very binary plays on being really right or really wrong. And it reminds me of the beginning of Wide World of Sports. Y'all remember that? I'm dating myself a little bit. Who remembers the Wild World of Sports? Remember the guy going down the skiing hill and he wrecks? The thrill of victory and the agony of defeat. I don't want to reduce my trading to simply that. However, now that tide's being lifted, now that NASDAQ's punching through, gosh, 19,000, that's amazing. We're just below it right now, but huge. We're up almost 1% on the NASDAQ futures. We can definitely see that we're cutting the road to the upside. So let's keep to the long side of things and find those trends. And if you're looking for them and you're having struggling finding them, come check out what we're doing in the Sector Secrets Mastery. That's at sectorsecrets.com. All right, gang, be good to each other. I'll talk with you soon.